Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is the Bible and Science, episode number 24. We've been dealing with the age of the earth for the last several episodes, and in this one we're going to get into one of the common things that I think is a deception among Christians called the gap theory, that says that there was a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Why do people believe the earth is old? Number one, that's what they've always been told. Number two, they believe that it takes millions of years to form a fossil. Number three, they misunderstand radiometric dating. Number four, there are geologic features such as the separation of the continents, the Grand Canyon, and so forth, that are supposed to have taken millions of years to form. The sedimentary layers are found continent-wide around the world. So if you go to various places, not only in the U.S. but overseas, you're going to see that there are bent rock layers. For instance, those are pictures in the Swartberg Mountains of South Africa, where I went. And if you go to the Grand Canyon, if you go to Meteor Crater in Arizona, you're going to see that there's a whole bunch of sedimentary layers that are messed up, that they're bent, but they're not shattered. So evolutionists believe that the rocks bent over millions of years, long after the sediment hardened into rock. Creationists say, no, you can't bend a hardened rock. Instead, we believe that they were bent while they were still soft. So in Meteor Crater, if you look at the center picture, evolutionists believe that the meteor, the Canyon Diablo meteorite, blasted through hardened rock. Well, to me, that would indicate it was going to shatter. But creationists note that the impact looks very much like the impact of a bullet in soft mud. Now, if you look around the world, you're going to see that there are about 4 dozen or so individual types of rocks that have been given names, Upper Cretaceous, Lower Cretaceous, and so forth. But there's only a few dozen. Now, if evolution is really true, then there should have been continual gradual change from the very beginning up until the present. Things shouldn't be grouped. They shouldn't be clearly defined communities, which creationists would say are ecological communities. But one of the things I think best illustrates what they actually are is the Grand Cayman Islands, south of Cuba. There are 4 distinct ecological communities living at the same time and the same place, with the difference being elevation or depth below sea level. From 0 to 200 feet, you have an area called the reef, which has thousands of typical shallow water species. There are corals, barracudas, stingrays, eels, and so forth. Then you go down under 200 feet, between 200 to 600 feet, there's an area commonly called the wall or the sponge belt. There are lots and lots of various types of sponges. There are worms and crustaceans. But if you go down under 600 feet, and this is not just made up, this is something that if you had your own little submarine, you could go down and see. So down under 600 feet to about 1,000 feet, there's an area that's commonly called the haystacks, which has a lot of debris broken off from above. This contains sharks, starfish, sea whip, corals, sea urchins, things like that. And then at the same place, but a little different, 1,000 feet and more at the deep, which is pretty much totally dark, there are things like cookie cutter sharks, coffin fish, tripod fish, spidery arm jellyfish, sea cucumbers, and so forth. There are 4 distinct communities that really don't blend together very much. They separate according to the depth. So us creationists would say that this is similar to what we see in the fossil record, where you have the upper Cretaceous, the lower Cretaceous, and so forth, that these are not the same community. They're independent communities. They're ecological communities or biomes, and they thrive at the same time, same place, same circumstances, similar circumstances. So if we could instantly freeze that area, it would look very much like the suites of fossils that we see in the fossil record. This is a phenomenon that you see around the world. There are ecological communities all over the place. Animals and plants live in interdependent communities or biomes. They vary according to a number of factors: the climate, the elevation above or below sea level, things like that. And, there's a bunch of different factors involved, but they're fairly clearly defined and they don't blend over very much into another. Actually, there are some things that will live in multiple communities. Unfortunately for us, rats are found everywhere nowadays. Well, there are some things in the fossil record that are found in a number of communities, but in general, the communities are pretty separate. So these are two of the ecological communities, the ecosystems found in Colorado, of which there are 8 in that one state alone. So I've been showing what's wrong with the evolutionary timescale, which is based upon the assumption of uniformitarianism. Everything happens at slow, steady, gradual rates over millions and millions or tens of millions of years. Well, that's, I think, falsified. But are there any positive indications that the Earth might be much younger than billions of years? I'm so glad you asked that question. We could use anything that changes with time as a clock to try to get an estimate of the age of the Earth, the age of various things. So you can't use any one of these to get an absolute age, but you can use it to set limits. So the moon is receding from the Earth, and about 1.37 billion years ago, it would have been scraping the surface of the Earth. So that's going to put a maximum indication, based on recession of the moon, of 1.37 billion years max. It could be anything less. Galaxy clusters are breaking up, and the universe is supposed to be about 13.8 billion years old, give or take a little bit. However, the galaxy clusters would indicate a maximum age of about 1 billion years rather than 13.8. Spiral galaxies, likewise, would point toward an indication of 1 billion or less years, and it could be anything less. The amount of salt going into the oceans is something that could accumulate within 100 million years. In fact, that's something that's going to put an age limit on the oceans of 100 million years. Now, if they started with any salt whatsoever, that's going to greatly bring down the age. Okay, the Earth's crust has got a certain thickness. It gradually is going to be thickening, like if you're cooking something and you have a pot boiling and you turn off the heat, it's going to start to cool, and there are going to be different thicknesses of different layers. Well, the thickness and the amount of change, the temperature gradient of the Earth's crust, is going to bring it down to about 45 million years tops. The Bible says something less than 7,000 years. We don't know exactly, but this is getting a whole lot lower than the 13.8 billion years supposedly of the universe. The amount of helium in the atmosphere. Helium is, among other things, it's a decay product of many radioactive series, alpha decay. And so if the amount of helium was 0 at the beginning, in order to build up to the present amount of helium-4, it would take no more than about 4 million years. And if there was any helium at all, and if there's any other source of helium-4, then that's going to bring it down yet more. The rings of Saturn were really astonishing when we sent NASA probes, and the conclusion was, oh, they must have formed less than 1 billion years ago. The little moon Io that I showed you before, circling around Jupiter, Io indicates with its volcanic activity that it probably has a maximum age of less than 1 million years. Okay, the space dust in our region of space would be gradually swept away, be gradually vacuumed up by the sun. This is called the Poynting-Robertson effect. And the amount of dust out there indicates that it hasn't been going on for more than about 200,000 years. Then if you look at the amount of pressure in the oil wells and the gas wells, that's going to bring it down to maybe 100,000 years. If you look at the thickness of the sediments in the Nile, that's going to bring it down to about 30,000. And then speaking of radiometric dating and carbon dating, if the Earth's atmosphere started with no carbon-14 and is all produced just by cosmic radiation striking nitrogen in the atmosphere, it would take no more than 30,000 years at the present rate to accumulate what we've got out there. And of course, it could be anything less. The amount of salt going into the Dead Sea would indicate that it's a maximum of about 13,000 years. Short period comets fall apart after, say, less than 10,000 years, and there's still a lot of them out there. The Earth's magnetic field is continually decaying in strength, and it would take it no more than about 10,000 years to reach its present level. Even if it started out very, very high, it would still be no more than 10,000 years to get to the present level. And the amount of uranium in the oceans would indicate a maximum amount of time of about 10,000 years. These are not the only ones, but notice that most of them are far less than billions or even far less than millions of years. One of the things I get asked occasionally is, what about carbon dating? Well, what is carbon dating? There are several forms of the element carbon. Carbon-12 is by far the most common one. It has 6 protons, which identify it as carbon, and it also has 6 neutrons. It's a very stable atom. But up in the upper atmosphere, cosmic radiation coming in from space strikes nitrogen-14 atoms, and this does something to the nucleus where one of the neutrons in the nitrogen atom is turned into a proton. That is, part of it is knocked away and combined and so forth. So by the time it's finished, carbon-14 is produced. It has 6 protons, just like carbon, but it has 8 neutrons. And one of those neutrons wants to change back, and eventually it will. So that unstable neutron will eventually turn back into a proton. When it does, it's back to nitrogen-14. So if you start from 0, the atmosphere, remember, is mainly nitrogen. If you start from 0, the cosmic radiation striking nitrogen in the atmosphere is gradually going to make some of it turn into carbon-14, but eventually it's going to turn back into nitrogen at the same rate. It will reach equilibrium. So starting from 0, the amount of carbon-14 would build up until it was decaying as fast as it formed, and it's been measured, the production rate and decay rate. It would take, at present, less than 20,000 years to reach equilibrium, where the nitrogen-14 turns into carbon-14 and the carbon-14 turns back into nitrogen-14. Well, yeah, but there have been measurements showing that carbon-14 is still forming 20 to 30% faster than it's decaying. That would indicate that it's been forming for less than 20,000 years, which would put a maximum age on the atmosphere of about 20,000 years. Okay, and think about this. Suppose you have a bucket of water and you set off a firecracker inside of it. After a few seconds, things settle down and you don't see any trace. The water has to be frozen, has to be solidified, and then if you set off a firecracker, you're going to get scorch marks, you're going to get various kinds of things as a result of the explosion. Well, it has to be completely solidified in order for anything to show up. This is similar to what happens with certain radioactive elements. If a bunch of radioactive atoms decay inside of a rock that's still melted, there's no traces left after the rock cools. But if the rock is solid when the atoms decay, they leave tiny spherical scorch marks. These are called pleochroic halos. We can tell what produced the halos by their diameter and by what's left at the center. So we look at the scorch marks at the shells and we say, oh, okay, it presently has this thing in there and here's the size of the rings around it. So we can work backwards and say, okay, that's what it had to come from, and it had to be completely solidified in order to leave these traces. So if you see shells in the rocks, which has been done by Dr. Robert Gentry, he's personally analyzed hundreds of thousands of these, and you find out that there's an element there called polonium-214. It has a half-life, that is, half of a radioactive sample will decay into in 164 microseconds. Polonium-218 has a half-life of 3.1 minutes. Polonium-210 has a half-life of 138 days. But it supposedly came from uranium, which has to be completely solidified for all of this to happen. And the uranium-238 in the center has a half-life calculated at 4.5 billion years. Remember, we've never been seeing this happen because we haven't been here for 4.5 billion years. But we can find polonium-10 halos with no parent, no center part. They can only form in rocks that are solid within a few years. Polonium-218 can only form the spherical shells in rocks that have been just as a matter of minutes. And for polonium-214, which has a half-life measured in microseconds, the rocks had to be fully hard within a matter of seconds from the time the polonium was first there. So for polonium-214, the rocks had to harden within a matter of seconds. Now, Dr. Robert Gentry has published a great deal on this. He was working at one of the government laboratories and he was writing about what he had observed in the rocks. And as long as he didn't get into the logical implications, he was okay. But then one time he challenged people in one of the professional technical publications, saying he could not see any other explanation for the polonium halos other than instantaneous creation of the rocks. Well, he had been working there for years, and all of a sudden he got a letter of dismissal saying, well, because of budget cutbacks, we're going to have to terminate your research. He was making $1 a year at the time. His salary was paid by Loma Linda University. But the pleochroic halos don't by themselves prove that the Earth is young, but they do show that the rocks containing them had to solidify in a matter of seconds rather than hundreds of millions of years. So whenever the basement rock was formed, it was formed fast. So no one has ever successfully rebutted Dr. Gentry's contention that the halos point strongly toward instantaneous creation. All they did was fire him. Another thing that happens, many radioactive decay series produce helium. So the helium starts out inside of a rock, but helium molecules are so small they can gradually work their way through the rock crystal until they escape. So the rate of diffusion has been measured, and the escape time has been calculated to be on the order of a few tens of thousands of years. So if it's more than a few tens of thousands of years, there shouldn't be any helium inside these rocks. But there are many rocks that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old. They've been split open, found to contain significant amounts of helium. That would limit the age of the rocks to no more than a few tens of thousands of years old, not millions of years. Now remember, this does not prove anything specific about when the rocks came into existence. It just shows, oh, maybe they're not quite as old as what we thought. It doesn't prove the Earth is young, but it shows that it could be. And there also is no compelling scientific reason that the Earth has to be billions of years old. Maybe it's less. So here's a question for you. How much time would God need to create everything? If you believe in an infinite, all-powerful God, he could have done it in 6 microseconds if he felt like it. Could have done it in 6 billion years if he felt like it. Could have done it in 6 days if he felt like it. If you believe in the God of the Bible. How much time would God need? As much or as little as he wanted to. What did he say? He said he created in 6 days, and it was only a few thousand years ago. So do you believe your concept of God? Mine is the biblical God. Do you believe God was there and knows what happened? Or do you believe, if you still say, well, there's some sort of a God, but not according to the Bible, then you would have to believe that the creation account in the Bible is more or less a fairy tale. I don't. I accept it because I accept God as being all-powerful. So how about Christians who believe that the earth is very old? What if the earth is billions of years old? What's the big deal? Well, first, do you believe in an all-powerful God or not? Then, has he spoken to us? Is the Bible his revealed word? And then, is he capable of telling the truth? Or is he just lying? Or was he unable to figure out how to tell us what happened until the evolutionists, the Big Bang theorists came along? I'm going to say I believe in an all-powerful God. It's up to you to decide what you believe. But I want you to think about something that really relates to how old the earth is. Paul the apostle, writing to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the resurrection chapter, he said, some among you deny that there's a future resurrection. Well, that's what we're promised, future resurrection. So in verse 12, he says, some of you deny there's a resurrection coming in the future. So Paul replied in verse 17 through 19 of 1 Corinthians 15. He said, well, if that's the case, we're of all men most to be pitied. We have no power in our gospel. We have no hope in the present. So Paul explained, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 21 to 22 and 45, he explained why Jesus had to die. The fall of Adam in the past shows the purpose of the gospel. He said, for since by man came death, who was that? Oh, we're about to find out. By man came also the resurrection of the dead, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit, a life-giving spirit. He doesn't say the second Adam, he says the last Adam. There was the first Adam, and then the last Adam, Jesus, came along to undo what he did. But if death was here before that first man, Adam, sinned, then Adam was a myth. So if the first Adam was a myth, what do you need a last Adam for? Jesus died because of something that never happened. There was no first man who brought sin and death into the world, so you don't need a last man to undo that. I reject that. I believe that God told us the truth about the first human being, Adam, the first man. And so I'm going to say, well, if the first Adam did what he said, then the last Adam did what he said. But there were many well-meaning Christians. They accept the evolutionary idea that the earth is billions of years old. There are two main old earth positions held to by Christians. One is called the gap theory. This says when you read Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Well, they're going to reinterpret that and retranslate a word, the earth was without form and void, to say the earth became without form and void. So what happened during the became? There was a gap of millions or billions of years between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. So we're going to talk about that in this session and the next session. Later on, we'll get back to what's called the day-age theory. It says each of the days of Genesis was actually a period of millions or billions of years. That's just theistic evolution. God decided he wanted to use evolution, so he put it in sort of poetic language. Neither one of these is a theory, even though the gap theory is called a theory, the day-age theory. Well, if you remember from an earlier episode, a theory is something that can be tested, directly tested repeatedly. You can't test either one of those. So they're not really theories, they're models or hypotheses or just ideas. So the day-age theory we'll get back to later on when we're talking about did evolution occur at all. But neither one of these leads you to any predictions. So here's what the gap theory says. In the early 1800s, Thomas Chalmers of Edinburgh University in Scotland, he assumed that two of the well-known figures of his day, Buffon and Cuvier, must be right about the age of the earth. He still wanted to believe the Bible, so he tried to find a way to fit millions of years into the biblical account. So this required a retranslation of Genesis 1 verses 1 to 2. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. He had to retranslate it. Instead of the earth was without form, the earth became without form and void. The gap theory, which is also known as ruin restoration, it says there was a pre-Adamic creation that existed peacefully for perhaps millions of years until Lucifer decided he would take God's place. Then he rebelled against God. The whole world was destroyed in a pre-Adamic flood, and then God started over with Adam and Eve. Here are some of the arguments that are used in favor of the gap theory. Genesis 1:2 said the earth was without form and void, and then those who believe in the gap theory come back with Isaiah 45:18 that says the earth was not created without form. Well, what it actually says, this is from the King James, for thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. So when God originally called matter and energy into existence, it was not yet organized, but it was not created in vain. It had a definite purpose, which became evident throughout the creation week. Another argument used in favor of the gap theory, Genesis 1:28 says, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. That's the King James Version. So those that follow the gap theory says that replenish means to refill, so the earth must have been filled with people and became empty. Yes, but at the time the King James was translated 400 years ago, replenished meant simply to fill. The Hebrew word from which it comes, which is malah, does not indicate a refilling. I'm planning to continue this in the next video, so there will be a significant amount more about the gap theory. Many Christians have followed this because they think that somehow the earth has been proven to be old, which is not true. So we'll talk about more of the spiritual implications. Later on, we'll talk about the day-age theory because it's just basically theistic evolution. So next episode, we'll continue on with the gap theory.